Imagine giving 40 years of your life to a family, breaking your back in the freezing snow and scorching sun, only to have the spoiled heir spit in your face on the day you retire. Jensen Clark didn't just fire Mark Bates, he tried to destroy him. He handed the old cowboy a deed to a rattlesnake-infested shack and the lead rope of a dangerous trash horse as a cruel joke, laughing as he watched them walk away to die. But Jensen made a fatal mistake. He didn't know that the trash horse carried the blood of kings, and he didn't realize that the worthless shack sat on top of a secret that would bring the mighty ranch to its knees. This is a story about why you should never judge a book by its cover, and why the underdog always has one fight left. You are going to want to hear every second of this amazing story. Before we saddle up, please take a moment to tap that like button and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us write more heart-touching stories like this to share with you. Now, let's go to Montana. The heat of the mid-July afternoon didn't just sit on the Double C Ranch. It pressed down with the suffocating weight of a cast-iron skillet left too long on the fire. Dust motes, disturbed by the shifting weight of restless horses, danced in the sharp, angled shafts of light piercing the high clerestory windows of the main barn. They swirled like tiny, floating galaxies in the stagnant air, settling on the brims of hats and the shoulders of men who were too tired to brush them off. For 40 years, Mark Bates had breathed this dust. It was more than just dirt to him. It was a geological record of his life. It was in the scarred tissue of his lungs, in the deep, permanent creases of his weathered knuckles, and woven into the very fabric of his soul. He knew the smell of this barn better than he knew the scent of his own skin, a complex perfume of sweet alfalfa hay, curing leather, sharp ammonia, and the warm, musky scent of horse sweat. But today, the air tasted different. Today, it tasted like ash and betrayal. Mark stood near the tack room door, a shadow in the periphery. He held his hat in hands that trembled slightly. Not from fear, he told himself, but from the persistent, grinding arthritis that had become his constant, unwanted companion over the last decade. He was 64 years old, though the mirror in the bunkhouse bathroom, cracked and stained with hard water, claimed he looked closer to 80. His face was a map of the Montana weather, deep canyons around the eyes from squinting at the sun, and wind-burned skin that felt like parchment. He wore his best shirt, a plaid snap button that he had starched stiff the night before in the communal laundry sink. The collar chafed his neck, but he wore it out of respect. Respect for the ranch, respect for the memory of Arthur Clark, and respect for the dignity of a job well done. He had expected a handshake. Maybe a plaque made of cheap wood. Perhaps, if the rumors circulating the bunkhouse were true, the small pension Arthur Clark had promised him in a quiet conversation by the fence line 3 years ago. Instead, Mark watched Jensen Clark pace back and forth in front of the assembled ranch hands. Jensen, barely 30, moved with the restless, jerky energy of a man who had never learned the patience of the seasons. He wore designer jeans that were too tight to work in, and boots made of exotic lizard skin that had never touched a shovel or a stirrup in anger. He checked his watch, a heavy gold chronograph that flashed obscenely in the dim light, every 30 seconds, as if his time was a currency too valuable to spend on the men who made his lifestyle possible. "All right, let's get this over with," Jensen said, his voice carrying a nasal, grating pitch that cut through the respectful silence of the barn. "I have a meeting in Bozeman at 4. As you all know, we're trimming the fat. Restructuring. The Double C can't run on sentimentality and nostalgia anymore. Grandfather is gone, and so are his outdated bleeding heart ways." Mark stiffened, his spine straightening instinctively. Arthur Clark had been a giant of a man, not in physical stature, but in spirit. He had known the name of every horse, every cow, and every hand on the payroll. He had respected the land as a partner, not a resource to be strip-mined. Jensen, by contrast, only respected the ledger. To him, a horse was an asset, and a man was an expense. "Mark here," Jensen gestured vaguely in Mark's direction with a manicured hand, not bothering to make eye contact, "has been with us a long time. Too long, really. The efficiency reports, which I'm sure none of you understand, show he's operating at about half the physical capacity of the younger hands. Liability insurance alone is killing us on him." A low murmur, like the rumble of distant thunder, went through the crowd of cowboys. They shifted their weight, boots scraping on the concrete aisle. Some looked at the ground, ashamed to witness the humiliation of a man who had taught them how to throw a rope. Others glared at Jensen with a heat that could have ignited the hayloft. They knew Mark was the first to rise, long before the coffee pot hissed, and the last to sleep. They knew he could diagnose a colic or a stone bruise by the sound of a hoofball alone. However, Jensen continued, a cruel smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth as he enjoyed his power, we aren't heartless. Grandfather left a scribbled note about taking care of you. So instead of a cash pension, which, frankly, the ranch does not have the liquidity to afford right now due to previous mismanagement, I'm giving you property. You're becoming a landowner, Mark. Moving up in the world. Mark's heart gave a hopeful, desperate thump against his ribs. A small plot, he wondered. Maybe the gardener's cottage by the north gate. You know the Cinder Creek tract? Jensen asked, his eyes dancing with malice. The silence in the barn deepened, becoming heavy and absolute. Even the horses seemed to stop chewing their hay. Cinder Creek was the badlands of the estate, 5 miles out, a jagged scar of geography known for flash floods, scorching rock, and rattlesnakes. It was a desolate corner where the sun seemed to burn hotter, and the grass refused to grow, a place Arthur had only kept because it connected 2 grazing allotments. There's a structure on it, Jensen said, struggling to suppress a laugh that bubbled up in his throat. The old trapper's shack. It's yours, deed and all. Lawyer Wood has the paperwork. But wait, there's more. A rancher needs a horse, right? You can't be a cattle baron without a steed. And we just acquired a bulk lot from the auction. Most are decent, but there's one. Well, he's a bit of a project. We call him Trash. He's unrideable, dangerous, and frankly, dog food waiting to happen. But since you're the horse whisperer, around here, he's your retirement bonus. Jensen snapped his fingers, the sound sharp as a whip crack. 2 young stable boys, looking apologetic and terrified, led a horse into the center aisle. Mark's breath caught in his throat, a jagged intake of air. The animal was a nightmare of neglect, a walking testament to human cruelty. He was a gelding, or so it seemed, with a coat the color of dirty soot, matted with burrs, dried mud, and feces. His ribs showed through his flank like the rotting frame of an old canoe, each bone distinct and painful to look at. But it was his eyes that held Mark captive. They rolled wild and white, screaming a silent, terrified panic that Mark felt in his own chest. The horse reared, striking out with hooves that were overgrown and cracked, the shoes long gone. The stable boys scrambled back, the lead rope pulling taut. There you go, Jensen laughed, the sound echoing off the rafters like a gunshot. Trash for the trash heap. You and him deserve each other. You have until sunset to clear out of the bunkhouse. I want your bed empty for the new hire coming tomorrow. Mark looked at the terrified animal, then at Jensen. A younger Mark, the Mark who had ridden bulls in the rodeo, the Mark who had broken his nose 3 times, might have fought. He might have thrown the lead rope at Jensen's feet, planted a fist in that smug face, and walked away. But Mark looked at the horse again. He saw the tremble in the animal's flank. He saw a creature that had been used up, discarded, mocked, and left to rot. He saw himself. Slowly, painfully, Mark placed his hat on his head, pulling the brim low. He walked past Jensen, ignoring the paperwork thrust at him, and approached the rearing horse. He didn't raise his hands. He didn't shout. He simply let his breath out in a long, low, vibrating hum, a sound he had used for 40 years to soothe frightened colts. Easy, son, Mark whispered, his voice like dry leaves scraping over pavement. I gotcha. I'm not gonna hit you. He reached out and took the rope from the shaking stable boy. For a moment, the horse froze, confused by the sudden lack of tension, the lack of violence in the man's posture. Mark turned his back on Jensen, on the snickering sycophants, and on 40 years of his life. Come on, Mark said to the horse, his voice breaking slightly. Let's go home. The walk to Cinder Creek was a 5-mile purgatory. The sun beat down on Mark's neck, searing the skin above his collar. The air was dry, sucking the moisture from his mouth until his tongue felt like a piece of felt. His knees clicked and popped with every step over the uneven, rocky ground, sending spikes of hot pain up his thighs. The horse, whom Mark had decided to call Cinder, not because he was trash, but because a cinder was a remnant of fire that still held heat, a promise of a flame that could return, danced nervously at the end of the rope. Every snapping twig, every rustling sagebrush, every shadow of a hawk passing overhead sent the animal into a frenzy of snorts and sideways lunges. Mark's shoulder ached from the constant pulling, but he never jerked the rope. He simply held on, a steady, grounding anchor. Mark's internal monologue was a stormy sea of regret and anger. 40 years, he thought, looking at the heat shimmering off the rocks. I gave that family my youth. I missed my brother's funeral because it was calving season. I didn't marry Sarah because I couldn't afford a ring on a ranch hand's wage. I broke my back for Arthur. And this is the thank you? A patch of rocks and a death sentence. But as he looked back at the horse, seeing the ribs heaving with exertion and fear, the anger cooled into a resolve that felt like iron settling in his gut. They want us to die out here, he realized. They want us to fade away so they don't have to look at their guilt. Jensen wants to drive past in a year and see a pile of bones. Well, I've never been good at doing what I'm told. They arrived at the property as the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the vast Montana sky in bruises of purple, deep orange, and blood red. The old trapper's shack was worse than Mark had imagined in his darkest pessimism. It was a leaning skeleton of gray, weathered wood, the roof sagging like a weary spine under the weight of years of snow. The windows were jagged maws of broken glass, looking like missing teeth. The front porch had collapsed on one side. Mark tied Cinder to a sturdy mesquite bush. The fence was non-existent, and pushed open the front door. The smell hit him instantly. A pungent cocktail of rat urine, dry rot, and abandonment. Rodents scurried into the shadows, their claws scrabbling on the warping floorboards. "Home sweet home," Mark muttered, coughing in the dust. He closed the door. The house was a problem for another day. Behind the shack, there was a barn. It was small, older than the house, built from hand-hewn timber that had turned silver with age. It leaned slightly to the west, but the roofline was straight. Mark inspected it, testing the beams with his weight. The roof was tight. The stalls were filled with decades of debris, old tractor parts, rusted wire, but the bones were good. The timber was solid. Priorities, Mark whispered to himself. He spent the last hour of light clearing a stall in the barn, using a rusted shovel he found leaning against the wall. The physical labor was agony, his back screaming, but he didn't stop. He laid down fresh bedding made from dried tall grass he cut by hand with a pocket knife, lacking a scythe. He led Cinder into the stall. The horse trembled, his muscles bunched tight as coiled wire, eyes darting into the dark corners. Mark had no grain. He had no hay. He only had a bucket of water he'd drawn from the creek, which was barely a muddy trickle, and a single red apple he'd saved from his lunch. He sliced the apple with his pocket knife and offered a piece on a flat palm. Cinder struck out, snapping his teeth, his ears pinned flat against his skull. Mark didn't flinch. He didn't punish. He just left the apple slice on the rail and retreated to the corner of the stall. He sat down heavily in the straw, his joints popping. "I know," Mark said softly to the horse, his voice filling the small space. "I know you hate us. I know you think every hand is a fist and every voice is a threat. I'm not going to ask you to change your mind tonight. You've got a right to be angry." Mark didn't go to the house. The thought of the rats and the emptiness was too much. He slept in the corner of the stall, curled into a ball in his denim jacket, listening to the horse pace and snort in the darkness. He was hungry, his stomach cramping, but he fell asleep to the sound of Cinder finally crunching the apple. Days turned into weeks, blurring into a grueling routine of survival. Mark woke before dawn, his body stiff as a board, requiring 10 minutes of stretching just to stand upright. He spent his days fighting the cabin, patching the roof with scrap tin found in the weeds, boarding up windows with reclaimed wood, scrubbing the floors with river sand and water until his hands were raw. But his real work, his soul's work, was the horse. Mark learned that Cinder wasn't just wild. He was deeply traumatized. If Mark raised a hand too quickly to brush a fly away, Cinder would throw himself against the fence, shaking. If Mark held a broom, Cinder would sweat and panic. Someone hurt you bad, Mark thought. watching the horse from the porch of the shack as he drank watery coffee. Someone took the spirit out of you and replaced it with fear. They broke your heart before they broke your body. The turning point came 3 weeks into their exile. The heat broke with a violence that shook the valley floor. The sky turned a sickly, bruised shade of green, and the clouds began to boil and rotate. A summer supercell was rolling in over the mountains. The air pressure dropped so fast, Mark's ears popped, and the static electricity made the hair on his arms stand up. Thunder cracked like a cannon shot, a physical blow that shook the very ground. Mark looked out the window to see Cinder in the makeshift paddock. The horse was screaming, a high, terrified sound that chilled Mark's blood. Cinder was galloping blindly, crashing into the flimsy fencing Mark had erected, tearing his skin on the wire. The lightning flashed, illuminating the horse's terror in strobe light bursts. Mark didn't think. He didn't weigh the risks. He grabbed his coat and ran out into the deluge. The rain was cold and hard, stinging his face like thrown gravel. "Cinder!" he yelled, but the wind tore the name away. He managed to open the gate and herd the frantic animal into the barn. But inside, the sound of the thunder hammering on the tin roof was deafening, amplified like a drum. Cinder was rearing, his hooves striking the wooden walls, splinters flying. He was sweating profusely, eyes rolling back in his head. He was going to hurt himself, maybe break a leg, and out here, a broken leg meant a bullet. Mark slammed the barn door shut and latched it against the wind. He was trapped in the small space with 1,000 pounds of panicked, thrashing muscle. Mark moved to the center of the barn, near the stall door. He sat down heavily in the straw, right where Cinder could see him but couldn't reach him with a hoof. He needed to be a grounding rod. He needed to be the calm in the chaos. And he began to sing. It wasn't a pretty song. Mark's voice was gravelly, cracked from disuse and smoke, and he couldn't hold a tune to save his life. It was an old hymn his mother used to hum while hanging laundry. "In the garden, I come to the garden alone, while the dew is still on the roses." Cinder scrambled in the corner, blowing hard, his nostrils flaring red like coals. Mark kept singing, rocking slightly, eyes closed, letting the memories of his mother's kitchen wash over him to keep his own fear at bay. "And the voice I hear, falling on my ear, the Son of God discloses." For hours the storm raged. The thunder rattled the old beams, threatening to bring the barn down. But inside, the melody became a constant, a tether to reality. Mark sang until his throat was raw. He sang until the adrenaline faded and exhaustion took over. He sang until the words lost meaning and became just a vibration of comfort. Sometime in the deepest, darkest part of the night, the rain slowed to a rhythmic, soothing drumming. The thunder moved east, a retreating army. Mark, slumped against the stall wall, felt his chin hit his chest. He drifted into a restless doze. He woke to a sensation of warmth. The barn was silent. The first gray light of dawn was creeping through the cracks in the wood, illuminating the dust motes. Mark froze. A large velvety muzzle was resting on his shoulder. Hot, rhythmic breath warmed his neck. Mark opened his eyes slowly, afraid to break the spell. Cinder was standing over him, head lowered. The panic was gone from the horse's eyes, replaced by a soft, dark curiosity. The horse let out a long, shuddering sigh, the sound of a prey animal releasing tension, and nudged Mark's cheek with his nose. Tears, hot and sudden, pricked Mark's eyes. He hadn't been touched with affection by a living thing in years. He slowly raised a hand, his arthritis protesting. Cinder didn't flinch. Mark rested his palm against the horse's jaw, feeling the strong bone and the soft skin. "Morning, partner," Mark whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "We made it." That afternoon, the real work began. With trust established, Mark could finally touch the horse properly. He mixed a bucket of warm water and grabbed a stiff brush he'd salvaged. "Let's see what's under there," Mark murmured, approaching the horse. "Let's get this mask off you." He began to scrub. The water in the bucket turned black instantly. Layers of mud, manure, grease, and neglect peeled away. It took hours. Mark's arms ached. His back throbbed, but he couldn't stop. He scraped away the trash. As the grime washed away, Mark stopped breathing. Underneath the matte, soot-colored filth, the horse's coat wasn't plain gray. It was a shimmering metallic mix of black and white hairs, a rare, stunning blue roan. When the sun hit the wet coat, it looked like polished gunmetal, rippling with hidden power. Mark moved to the hindquarters. He gently washed the hip. There, hidden under a patch of scar tissue that looked like an old burn or a barbed wire tear, he felt a ridge of skin. He looked closer, parting the wet hair. It was a brand, a stylized K inside a diamond. Mark frowned. That wasn't a Mustang brand, that wasn't a ranch brand from around here. That was a breeder's mark, a stamp of quality. He moved to the horse's head. "Open up," he coaxed gently, pressing his thumb into the corner of Cinder's mouth. The horse yielded, trusting him now. Mark lifted the upper lip. There, tattooed in fading ink against the pink gum, was a series of numbers and a letter. Mark stared at the tattoo. He traced the numbers with his thumb. A cold chill went down his spine that had nothing to do with the morning air. "Who are you?" Mark whispered to the horse, looking into those deep, intelligent eyes. "You aren't trash. You're royalty in disguise." The weeks that followed were a blur of intense rehabilitation and investigation. Mark used his meager savings, every penny he had squirreled away, to buy high-quality alfalfa and grain, eating instant noodles and canned beans himself to afford it. Cinder filled out. The ribs vanished under sheets of muscle. The dull coat became a mirror. Mark needed answers. He invited Martha Higgins to the cabin. Martha was the town clerk, a woman of 60 with a sharp mind, a sharper tongue, and a soft spot for Mark that had existed since high school, though neither had ever acted on it. She arrived in her dusty sedan, stepping out and looking at the transformed cabin with wide, assessing eyes. Mark had fixed the windows, cleared the yard of debris, and even planted wildflowers in pots by the door. "Mark Bates," she said, removing her sunglasses, "you've made a silk purse out of a sow's ear. I thought you'd be living in a tent." "Come see the sow," Mark said, a twinkle in his eye that hadn't been there in years. He led her to the paddock. Cinder was grazing, his blue roan coat gleaming against the green grass. When he saw Mark, he trotted over, arching his neck with a grace that belonged in a show ring, not a rock pile. He moved with a floating suspension that defied gravity. Martha gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "That's the trash horse Jensen laughed about? That creature?" "Look at this," Mark said. He showed her the photo he'd taken of the lip tattoo and the sketch of the brand. "Can you run these? I don't have internet out here, and I don't trust the library computers not to be monitored." "I'll do it tonight," Martha promised, tucking the photos into her purse. She stayed for tea, sitting on the porch as the sun went down. "You know, Mark," she said, looking out at the rocky ground, "I was looking at the old survey maps for this place before I came out. The deed Jensen gave you. It's an old homestead title. Arthur bought it in the 50s. It's rock and dust, Martha, good for snakes and not much else. On the surface," she said mysteriously, leaning in, "but the geological surveys from the 80s, Mark, this sits right on top of the limestone shelf. The main aquifer for the whole valley pinches right here. That spring you cleared, that's not a trickle. That's the overflow of a massive underground reservoir." Mark looked at the spring, which was now flowing steadily enough to create a small pond in the lower pasture. "So, I have water for the horse." "So," Martha said, tapping her cup for emphasis, "water is gold in Montana. The Double C is in a drought. Their wells are drying up. You're sitting on the tap. Now physically, you control it because you own the land. But legally, water rights are usually severed from the land deed in this county. Jensen might still own the rights to the water under your feet. It's a legal gray area, Mark. Be careful." 2 days later, Martha drove back. She didn't get out of the car. She ran to the porch, waving a folder. "Mark," she yelled. "Mark, you need to sit down." Mark wiped his grease-stained hands on a rag and sat on the steps. "The horse," Martha said, breathless. "The tattoo matches the Jockey Club registry, but he was reported dead 3 years ago, stolen from a transport van in Kentucky." Mark felt the blood drain from his face. "Stolen? His registered name is Northern Dancer's Echo, Martha read from the paper, her voice shaking. Sire was a Kentucky Derby winner. Dam was a quarter-horse cutting champion. He was an experimental cross, bred for speed and agility. Mark, he was insured for $200,000 as a yearling. Mark looked out at the pasture where Cinder was chasing a butterfly, looking like a playful colt. Jensen bought him in a bulk auction, Mark said quietly, piecing it together. Probably from a kill buyer lot, where they dump stolen horses when they can't sell them because of the brand. They disguised him with filth. Jensen didn't know. If Jensen knew what this horse was... Martha trailed off, the implication hanging heavy in the air. He'd want him back. Mark finished. He'd see dollar signs. As if summoned by the devil himself, a cloud of dust appeared on the horizon. A black truck, shiny, aggressive, and lifted high, was bouncing down the dirt road. "Speak of the devil," Mark muttered, standing up. "Martha, stay here." Jensen Clark slammed the door of his truck. He walked up to the fence, wearing aviator sunglasses and a sneer. But the sneer vanished when he looked past Mark. He saw the lush green grass of the paddock, fed by the spring. He saw the repaired cabin. And then he saw Cinder. The horse was galloping along the fence line, floating over the ground with an effortless, powerful stride. He looked magnificent, a creature of myth. Jensen took off his sunglasses. His mouth opened, then closed. That's the nag. That's Cinder," Mark said evenly, leaning on the gate, blocking Jensen's path. Jensen's eyes narrowed. He looked at the water flowing in the creek bed. He looked at the horse's conformation. He was greedy, but he wasn't blind to quality. "I am taking him back," Jensen said abruptly. "The transfer was a mistake. I gave you a sick animal to nurse back to health. It was a foster situation. I have the paperwork to prove it." "I have the bill of sale, Jensen," Mark said, his voice hard as granite. "And the video of you calling him trash and telling me to get off your land. My friend filmed it." Jensen stepped closer, invading Mark's space, smelling of expensive cologne and entitlement. "I'm the Clark heir. I have lawyers who can bury you in paper until you're dead. You think this land is yours? I'll find a loophole. I'll condemn the shack. I'll claim you stole ranch property." "Get off my land," Mark said. It was the first time in his life he had given Jensen an order. The words tasted sweet. Jensen laughed, but it was a cold, dangerous sound. "Enjoy it while it lasts, old man. I'm gonna crush you." The next week was a siege. Mark woke up to find the fences cut. Cinder was smart enough not to run, staying near the barn, but the threat was clear. Then, a sheriff's deputy arrived to serve Mark with a lawsuit, Clark versus Bates, alleging fraud and elder abuse regarding the land transfer. Then, the roadblock appeared. Jensen parked a massive tractor across the only access road to the highway, claiming it had broken down on ranch property, blocking Mark's exit to town for food or supplies. Mark felt the walls closing in. He had the truth, but he didn't have the money to fight a legal battle against the Clark fortune. He went to town, riding Cinder because the truck couldn't pass the tractor. He rode right up to the feed and seed where the locals gathered. The sight of the old cowboy on the magnificent blue stallion stopped traffic. People came out of the diner to watch. Jensen was there, holding court with some investors near the counter. He froze as Mark dismounted. "You blocked my road, Jensen," Mark said, his voice carrying through the silent store, over the bins of grain and racks of tools. "Private property disputes are messy," Jensen smirked, leaning back. "Why don't you just sign the deed back over? I'll give you $5,000 cash." "Generous." Mark looked around. The townspeople were watching. They looked tired of Jensen's arrogance, but afraid to speak up. "I'm not signing anything," Mark said. "But I hear you're entering that warm blood of yours in the Founders Race next month." The Founders Race was a grueling 20-mile endurance run through the canyons. It was dangerous, technical, and prestigious. "I am," Jensen said. "My horse cost $50,000. He's going to break the record." "Race me," Mark said. The room gasped. A coffee cup clattered to the floor. "Excuse me?" Jensen chuckled, looking Mark up and down. "Race me," Mark repeated. "If you win, I sign the land and the horse back to you. Free and clear, you get everything." "And if you win?" Jensen asked, amused by the absurdity. "You drop the lawsuit, you unblock the road, and you acknowledge, in writing, that Cinder and the land are mine forever." Jensen looked at Mark's arthritic hands. He looked at Cinder, who was standing quietly outside. Jensen saw an easy win. A thoroughbred cross couldn't handle the rocky canyon terrain like a warm blood. "You're on," Jensen said, extending a hand. "I hope you have a place to live, Mark, because you're going to be homeless." Mark shook the hand. "We'll see." The morning of the Founders' Race was crisp and cold. The starting line was a chaotic sea of color. Horses pranced, riders shouted, and the smell of fly spray, deep heat rub, and nervous sweat hung heavy in the air. Jensen Clark sat atop, quote, Titan, a massive Hanoverian warmblood. Jensen was decked out in English riding gear, polished tall boots, a pristine helmet, and a crop. Titan wore a complex bridle with a flash noseband to keep his mouth shut and a martingale to keep his head down. Mark stood next to Cinder. Mark wore his old denim jacket, his battered Stetson, and his worn chaps. Cinder wore a simple leather bridle with a gentle snaffle bit. No martingale, no tie-downs, just trust. "You look ridiculous," Jensen sneered as he trotted past. "That horse is going to break a leg in the scree. You're irresponsible." Mark patted Cinder's neck, feeling the steady pulse beneath the skin. "Listen to me," he whispered into the horse's ear. "We don't race him. We run our own race. You trust me. I trust you." The starter's pistol cracked. The pack surged forward like a tidal wave. Jensen spurred Titan, fighting for the front immediately. He pushed his horse hard, using the crop to force him through the initial bottleneck. Mark held back. He settled Cinder into a rhythmic, ground-covering trot. The horse wanted to run. His thoroughbred blood sang for speed, but he listened to Mark's seat. Not yet. Mark signaled with a slight shift of weight. "Save it." The first 5 miles were flat. Jensen was a speck in the distance. The other riders pushed hard. Mark stayed in the back, listening to Cinder's breathing. In, out, rhythmic, strong. They hit the canyon. The trail narrowed. The ground turned to loose shale and rock. This was where the trash land had been a blessing. Cinder had spent months navigating the rocky terrain of his paddock. He knew how to place his feet. While other horses stumbled and slid, Cinder moved like a mountain goat, sure-footed and balanced. He anticipated the terrain. They began to pass riders. One by one. Mark didn't push. Cinder just outlasted them. By mile 15, they were in the top 3. The horses ahead were lathered in foam, their breathing ragged. Cinder was sweating, but his ears were pricked forward. He was having fun. Then came Deadman's Drop. It was a notorious section of the trail, a narrow ledge with a sheer drop on one side and a canyon wall on the other. A recent storm had caused a rock slide, leaving a gap in the path about 4 feet wide. It was jumpable, but it was terrifying. Mark rounded the bend and saw Jensen. Jensen had stopped. Titan was refusing. The massive warmblood was trembling, backing away from the gap, eyes wide with terror. "Jump, you stupid beast!" Jensen screamed, striking the horse between the ears with his crop. Mark shouted, "Jensen, stop! He won't do it!" Jensen ignored him. Desperate not to lose, he racked the spurs into Titan's ribs. The horse panicked. Instead of jumping forward, Titan reared up, spinning on his hind legs to escape the pain. His hoof slipped on the loose gravel of the edge. It happened in slow motion. Titan scrambled, lost his footing, and fell sideways. Jensen was thrown clear, but he tumbled over the edge. Titan managed to scramble back to the trail, shaking and terrified, bolting down the path. But Jensen was gone. Mark heard the scream. It was raw and primal. He rode Cinder to the edge and looked down. Jensen had fallen about 20 feet, landing on a small outcropping of rock. His leg was bent at a sickening angle, the bone visibly distorting the denim. Below him was a 100-foot drop to the rushing river. "Help!" Jensen screamed, his voice thin with pain. "Mark! Help me, I'm slipping!" Mark looked at the finish line. It was 3 miles away. He could ride past. He could win. No one would blame him. Jensen had brought this on himself. Jensen had tried to ruin him. Mark looked at Cinder. The horse stood like a statue, waiting for a command. Goodness isn't about what you get, Mark thought, remembering Arthur Clarke's voice. It's about what you give when it costs you everything. Mark dismounted. He grabbed his lariat rope from the saddle horn. "Stand!" Mark told Cinder. He tied the end of the rope to the saddle horn. He walked to the edge and threw the loop down. It took 2 tries, but Jensen, weeping with pain, managed to grab it and loop it under his arms. "I can't pull you up!" Mark yelled. "I'm not strong enough. The horse has to do it!" Mark walked back to Cinder. He didn't get back in the saddle. He stood by Cinder's head, looking into the horse's dark, intelligent eyes. "Cinder," Mark said firmly. "Back!" The rope went taut. Cinder felt the weight. A lesser horse might have panicked at the backward pull, the feeling of being trapped. Cinder dug his hooves into the dirt. He lowered his haunches. "Back!" Mark commanded gently. "Easy! Back!" Step by step, muscle straining under the blue roan coat. Cinder walked backward. He pulled the dead weight of a grown man up a cliff face. He didn't slip. He didn't waver. He trusted Mark. Jensen's hand grasped the ledge. Mark grabbed him by the collar and hauled him onto the safety of the trail. Jensen lay in the dirt, sobbing, his face gray with shock. "My leg," he gasped. "It's broke." Mark didn't say, "I told you so." He checked the leg. It was a break, but Jensen couldn't walk. Mark knew he couldn't just throw him on the horse like a sack of feed. The pain would kill him. Mark took off his own denim jacket. He found 2 straight, sturdy branches from a nearby scrub oak. With gentle, firm hands, he splinted the leg, binding it tight with the sleeves of his jacket and his own belt. Jensen screamed once, then passed out from the pain, which was a mercy. Mark hauled the unconscious man onto Cinder's back, draping him carefully, tying him securely to the saddle so he wouldn't slip. Mark took the reins. "We walk from here," Mark said. They finished the race at a walk. When Cinder emerged from the canyon trail onto the final stretch, the crowd fell silent. They saw the blue roan stallion, covered in sweat but head held high. They saw Mark Bates, walking on foot, leading the horse. And they saw Jensen Clarke, the arrogant heir, slumped across the saddle, broken and defeated. Mark crossed the finish line. He was dead last. The silence held for a heartbeat, and then the crowd erupted. Not the polite applause of a race well run, but the roaring, stomping cheer of a town witnessing a miracle. Men threw their hats in the air. Women wiped tears. Medics rushed to take Jensen. As they loaded him onto a stretcher, Jensen stirred. He looked up at Mark through a haze of pain. The arrogance was gone, washed away by the terrifying realization of his own mortality. "You saved me," Jensen whispered, gripping Mark's sleeve. "Why? After everything I did?" "Because he's not trash," Mark said, patting Cinder's neck, which was wet with honest sweat. "And neither am I." The legal aftermath took place 2 days later in Jensen's private hospital room. The air smelled of antiseptic and lilies. Lawyer James Wood stood at the foot of the bed. Martha stood by the window, arms crossed. Mark sat in a plastic chair, his hat in his lap. Jensen's leg was in a cast, suspended in traction. He looked smaller, paler. The race conditions were clear. Jensen mumbled, staring at the ceiling, though his voice lacked its usual bite. "I bet that if I won, I'd get the land. If you won, I'd drop the suit." "And?" Mark asked calmly. "You came in last," Jensen said. "You didn't win. So, technically, the bet is off. I don't have to drop anything. And you didn't finish." Lawyer Wood interrupted, adjusting his glasses. "You were disqualified the moment you were separated from your mount. You were carried across the line. Neither of you won. The bet is void." Jensen let out a breath. Then, we are back to square one. I can still fight for that land. Not quite, Wood said, opening a thick leather portfolio. I am executing a codicil to the last will and testament of Arthur Clarke. It was sealed, to be opened only if a specific condition was met regarding the Cinder Creek tract. Jensen frowned. What condition? Wood read aloud. Whichever individual is in possession of the Cinder Creek tract and successfully rehabilitates a horse on that land, proving their stewardship of the earth and its creatures, shall be granted the executive water rights for the entire valley aquifer. The room went deadly silent. The beep of the heart monitor seemed deafening. Grandfather knew, Jensen whispered. He knew I dumped the land on someone I hated. He was testing me. He was testing your character, Wood corrected. He gave you a choice. You failed. Mark passed. Wood turned to Mark. The land is yours, the horse is yours, and the water rights. Mark, you control the water for the Double C. Martha was right about the location, but Arthur legally separated the water rights from the main ranch deed 40 years ago. They belong to Cinder Creek now. Without your permission, Jensen can't water a single cow. Mark looked at Jensen. He held the power to destroy the Double C ranch with a single signature. He could bankrupt Jensen by morning. He could take everything. I won't cut you off, Mark said quietly. Jensen looked at him, shocked. Why? Because the animals didn't do anything wrong, Mark said. But the price is going up. Fair market value. And every dime of profit goes into a trust to repair the other farms you've squeezed dry these last 6 months. And you step down as manager. Put someone competent in charge. Jensen closed his eyes, tears leaking out. He nodded. Agreed. The final piece of the puzzle arrived a month later. A long, silver trailer with Kentucky plates pulled up to the newly named sanctuary at Cinder Creek. An older couple stepped out. They were wealthy, clearly, dressed in tweed and silk, but they looked anxious. When Mark led Cinder out of the barn, the woman burst into tears. Echo, she sobbed, burying her face in the horse's mane. The horse nuzzled her pockets, remembering old treats, making a soft whickering sound. The husband shook Mark's hand, his grip firm. We thought he was dead. The police said the thieves likely killed him. We thought, well, we'd given up hope. You brought him back to life. He did the same for me, Mark said, his throat tight. We want to pay you, the man said. A reward, $50,000, and we'll take him home to the bluegrass. Mark's heart cracked. He knew legally the horse was theirs. He had prepared himself for this goodbye. He looked at Cinder, at the bond they shared, at the way the horse's coat shone in the Montana sun. He nodded slowly. He's a good horse. Take care of him. The woman looked up. She saw the heartbreak in Mark's eyes. She saw the way the horse leaned into Mark's body, seeking comfort, ignoring her for a moment to nudge Mark. She looked at her husband. They exchanged a silent conversation, a nod, a smile, that only people who love horses understand. Actually, the man said, clearing his throat, we've been talking. He's retired from racing. He's happy here. He's found his person. Mark looked up, hope surging in his chest like a bird taking flight. Sir, we'd like to transfer the papers to you, Mr. Bates, the man smiled. He stays here, on one condition. Mark looked at the horse, then back at the couple. Name it. If you ever breed him, the man said, we get the first foal. 2 years later. The sun was setting over the valley, but the light wasn't harsh anymore. It was golden, bathing the world in honey. The old trapper's shack was gone, replaced by a sturdy log lodge with a wraparound porch and flower boxes overflowing with petunias. A hand-carved sign over the main gate read, The Sanctuary, a place for second chances. Mark sat in a rocking chair, a cup of hot coffee in his hand. His arthritis still ached when it rained, but he didn't mind the pain anymore. It was just a reminder that he was alive. He watched the pasture. There were 10 horses now, old broodmares, a blind pony, a lame gelding, and a few others discarded by the world, all grazing in peace. And standing watch over them all, his blue roan coat shining like a jewel in the twilight, was Cinder. The horse lifted his head, saw Mark on the porch, and whinnied, a sound of pure, unadulterated joy that echoed off the canyon walls. Mark smiled, took a sip of coffee, and leaned back. The world had called them trash. Jensen had called them a joke. But as he looked at the paradise he'd built from rock and ruin, Mark knew the truth. They were the treasure, and they had finally been found. If this powerful story moved you, subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss another inspiring tale of courage, hope, and the extraordinary bonds between humans and horses. Share this video with a friend who would love this story.